We are going to go back to the beginning of the minor prophets. I looked it up because last week Betty Lou was asking the major prophets. We were wondering whether Daniel is a major prophet, and what's the difference between a major and a minor prophet. A lot of it's just the length of the book, but more than that, it's how the Jews, especially historically, have viewed them. The major prophets have a different place for them. They read from the major prophets very often. The minor prophets are only for special occasions, basically. So the major prophets are just for Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And there are 12 minor prophets, and they start with Hosea. So we're going to be doing Hosea today, starting Hosea today. But as I said before, the books of the Bible are not technically in chronological order. That being, they're in section order, but that being said, the sections are sort of in chronological order. Another way you could sort of do this division between the major and the minor prophets is the major prophets are written over this block of time, which overlaps the time that the minor prophets are written. So for instance, the beginning of Hosea is pretty early. I mean, early in terms of the prophets. I'll get to that in a minute. But for the most part, the Old Testament is like the oldest writings are earlier in the Old Testament. There's quite a bit of overlap here and there, but and among the minor prophets, for the most part, from what people can tell, they're mostly in chronological order. So Hosea being the first of the minor prophets makes it one of the older prophets. And it's got a couple interesting things about it. So it's probably written give or take 750 to 775 BC. So when I always tell you guys the big date to remember is 586 BC, which a lot of the prophets wrote around or near. This is well before that. So that's not even a glimmer in their eye when the destruction of the temple in 586. However, toward the end of the Hosea's writings could have been around the time that the Assyrians first were a threat, and there's not a specific date for that because they didn't destroy the temple, but some of Hosea's writings probably connect with the Assyrian invasion and war with the Jews in around the 730s BC. So that's one thing that sort of makes it interesting. Another thing that makes it interesting is Pat is here. Another thing that makes it interesting is most of the prophets don't say much about their own personal life, and there's a bit about the prophet Hosea's personal life, which is interesting. And we have a strange view at Pat's house. Not sure what that is. Anyway, so in the first and third chapter, there is a discussion of the prophet Hosea and who he married, and that's very interesting. And some of his personal life is in there. Which is real unusual in the prophets. And otherwise, a big part of the theme of the whole book is summarized in this phrase, which is in verse 13, chapter 13, verse 4. I have been the Lord your God ever since the land of Egypt. You know no God but me, and besides me there is no Savior. So it's this essentially, it's this God's love for the people, even though they keep messing up. The people are difficult to deal with and faithless, but God still cares for them. It's one of those books that I don't know how much I've ever read before. So I read a little bit today, and the first 3 chapters are really unique, kind of fun to read. So trying to think of anything else here before we get started. Oh yeah, there's sort of 2 sections. The first 3 chapters are sort of putting the context for the rest of the writing, and then a lot of the rest, chapters 4 through 14, it changes here and there, but chapters 4 through 14 is a lot of prophetic sayings, divine monologues, short sections. Like they're not a whole chapter. Even within the individual chapters, they're sort of mini sections. Not like if you've ever read the second half of Proverbs, where it's just 2-line sayings. Not quite that small, but a lot of sort of shorter sections packed in. So let's start on Hosea 1:1. And you'll see what I mean about, we're getting a little too much information, a little TMI on Hosea early in the book. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, in the days of King Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, and in the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take for yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. So he went out and took Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel, for in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. She conceived again and bore a daughter. Then the Lord said to him, name her Lo Ruhamah, for I will never, oh, by the way, which means not pitied. And Jezreel means God sows. For I will no longer have pity on the house of Israel or forgive them, but I will have pity on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. When she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said, name him Lo Ami, which means not my people. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. Wow. Okay.
In the beginning, it's funny because my book says, go take yourself an adulterous wife.
Yeah.
And children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord. So
yeah,
states it out right there. So he married Gomer.
As a dramatic symbolic action, God commissions Hosea to marry a wife prone to adultery and have her children bear ominous names. Her propensity toward whoredom will dramatically act out Israel's involvement with fertility deities and sexual rites.
So is that supposed to be, in my Bible in the beginning, it said, some people take it literally, some people take it allegorically, how do you think it's supposed to be meant? Is it really TMI, or is it just an example of Israel?
I normally when it's like allegory for the nation, there's obvious allegory. I'm guessing historically Hosea married someone very promiscuous. And my Bible says that it doesn't say, it only mentions, here we go. The second and third children are of whoredom in a literal sense, since only with respect to the first one is it said Hosea's wife bore him a child. Further, the daughter's name, Lo Ruhamah, is specifically associated with prostitution, and the second boy's name, Lo Ami, can be taken to mean no kin of mine. So they might have just been sleeping with random people to conceive the other children. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's a start to a Bible book. Just tell someone, hey, at the beginning of the book of Hosea, the prophet Hosea marries a promiscuous woman, has children with him, and then has children with other people, probably prostitutes. That's how the book starts.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Thank goodness God forgives everybody.
And this is the prophet writing the book. Like, this is, yeah. So yet the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which can be neither measured nor numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall take possession of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Say to your brother Ami and your sister Ruhamah. So even though it was a bad start, people are bad, but they're still going to be united, I guess. One Israel and Judah shall be gathered together as one tribal people.
What? How come they were split up in Judah and Israel to start with if they were having to put them back together? What was the cap that?
There's a reference, a very quick reference somewhere here. So the 12 tribes of Israel have long since not happened, even at this point. Even though this is 700 years before Christ, it's still the 12 tribes of Israel don't exist. But so Israel and Judah are the two tribes that existed even at the time of Jesus. So that much doesn't change. However, there are a couple references to the remnants of other tribes in this book. I thought it was in this first part, but I think Jezreel is somehow connected looking. It might have been something I read for that happens later in the book, but I think there is one of the other original 12 tribes is sort of semi-connected to the story here. But by the time of Jesus, there's only two tribes, and I've said this in other Bible studies, but this is a big sort of revelation for me, even though I took one of the courses I took had a lot of the geography, of especially around the time of Jesus, that the two tribes, the tribe of Israel and tribe of Judah, are actually not, they're near each other, but they're separated. And there's a foreign land in between them, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about. If Jesus is traveling between the areas that have Jerusalem and Judah to the areas that have Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee where he grew up, then he's traveling through Samaritan lands often. Which, so I'm assuming that context is existing even now because it mentions Israel and Judah. It mentions the two. So I'm assuming that's a similar context, even though it's 750 years before. Okay. As I said, another thing notice how it says their names were Lo Ami and Lo Ruhamah, and earlier in the chapter, and here they are slightly different. And what it says is an interesting note. The foreboding meanings of the symbolic names in 1:9 and 1:6 are here revoked by removing the initial Hebrew negative lo. So lo before someone's name is makes it a negative. So Ami, instead of being my people or not my people, Lo Ami is not my people. Ami means my people. Interesting how they changed the names, just taking that lo off. And Ruhamah, which is pitied, but with Lo Ruhamah, it's not to be pitied. So it's interesting that earlier in the same chapter it says you're gonna have these because God has given up on them. And at the end of the chapter, we're not even in the rest of the book, it says, okay, I'll have pity on you, and calls the name by different names. That's so. Instead of not my people or not to be pitied, my people are pitied, which is interesting. I don't know the Hebrew. I did read one other thing I read in the preface to this book, which is sort of an aside, is that the Hebrew writing of the book of Hosea is very difficult for translators. It's different from a few others. So the translation was apparently difficult for them. for whatever that's worth. Okay, so I'm going to continue on with chapter 2 here. Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face, and her adultery from between her breasts. Or I will strip her naked and expose her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and turn her into a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children also I will have no pity, because they are children of whoredom. For the mother has played the whore, she who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, they give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Therefore I will hedge up her way with thorns, I will build a wall against her, so that she cannot find her paths. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better with me than now. She did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished upon her silver and gold that they use for Baal. Therefore I will take back my grain in its time, and my wine in its season. I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. And now I will uncover her shame in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. I will put an end to all her mirth, her festivals, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed festivals. I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which he said, these are my pay for which my lovers have given me. I will make them a forest, and the wild animals shall devour them. I will punish her for the festival days of the Baals, when she offered incense to them, and she decked herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers and forgot me, says the Lord. Therefore I will now allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. From there I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she shall respond as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. On that day, says the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they shall be mentioned by name no more. I will make for you a covenant on that day with the wild animals, the birds of the air, and the creeping things of the ground. And I will abolish the bow, the sword, and the war from land. And I will make you lie down in safety. And I will take you for my wife forever. I will take you for my wife in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and mercy. I will take you for my wife in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. On that day I will answer, says the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. And the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil. And they shall answer Jezreel, and I will sow him for myself in the land. And I will have pity on Lo Ruhamah, and I will say to Lo Ami, you are my people. And you shall say, you are my God. So when I read this earlier,
You may want to tell Judy what we're reading.
Judy, we are in Hosea. I didn't see Judy popped in, and I only see the top of her head. Oh, not her head. That's a chair or something there. Okay. Hi, Judy. We are in the second chapter of Hosea. So,
what book?
Hosea.
Thank you.
I read the beginning. When you read the beginning of this chapter, you think it's talking about his wife, the adulterer woman, right? But it's clearly an allegory for the people, for the nation, as you go. It feels like it sort of goes back and forth a little bit between it. It gives you a little bit of like watching tennis, because not only is it sometimes feel like speaking about one woman rather than a nation, but it also feels like I'm going to condemn you. No, I'm going to save you. No, I'm going to condemn you. No, I'm going to save you. It kind of seems to go back and forth from that. Yeah.
So now are they one nation in chapter 2? Are they one nation? Have they become?
I don't think. Yeah, I think they are and were here. It's less about that and more about all the people in both of the areas being unfaithful to God. And I think that's the bigger thing here. Anytime you see Baal or fertility dances, my lovers, that's all about false idol worship. right? Where was the point? Oh yeah, verse 10, now I'll uncover her shame in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. That's probably reference to fertility gods that are not the God of Israel. The Baal is obviously a god that's not a God of Israel. But there's some, what I'm saying is it doesn't just have to have a name. There are some other references that are probably referencing false gods, right? Her lovers, that sort of thing. When you see that, that comes up.
What time frame are we looking at in correlation to like Moses or
Well after that,
okay.
So I hope no one who's a biblical scholar watches this next section, because I'm gonna probably make mistakes. But if you read through the Bible, there's sort of historical periods. You have the Exodus, the time with Moses. They come into the land, the promised land, and then there's a big time of the 12 tribes. And if you read Samuel, that area for kings, and they're mostly fighting against each other. I mean, that's what's really going on. So to me, I see that as a second period. You have that first period where they're wandering the desert. You have that second period where they're sort of settling the land, but they're kind of squabbling over land. You sort of have some unification once you get to the time of kings, like David, Solomon, that sort of thing. But and then we're sort of getting into the next period. In my head, I sort of, this is, like I said, I hope no biblical scholar reads this, because I'm probably say, oh, you're totally wrong. But and how much time is those things? But I'm thinking roughly 1200 BC to about the time of Christ is sort of the time of the prophets, that kind of a thing, right? The people are pretty settled at that point. So we're well beyond. I mean, Moses, I think they've thought Moses died entering the promised land 4,000 or 5,000 BC. So it's quite a bit before that, right? Quite since that's happened. We're sort of, it's weird to say it when we're talking about something that was 2,800 years ago, but in some ways this feels like more modern than a lot of those stories I talked about, like Kings and Samuel and the Exodus, right? I think because the context of the land at the time of Hosea is pretty similar to what it was at the time of Jesus, even though that's 750 years later.
Yeah, I see.
And for some reason, I'm thinking of Jesus being modern, but there you have it. But that's another thing that happens. That's going to start happening now too, and part of the reason the prophets are a big part of the story now. Previous to this, at least in the history of the Jewish people, there's not major nations, the conquests of the land, right? And starting now or very soon in this book, it's going to be one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. It's the Assyrians, and pretty much as soon as the Assyrians are gone, then the Babylonians, and soon the Babylonians are gone, then the Greeks, and soon the Greeks are gone, then the Romans. It's just going to be one after the other. So that's a better sort of context for this time. So this chapter has to do, I think, mostly with Israel. It's very sort of poetic, allegorical, but it has to do with Israel's sort of flirtation with other gods, with false idols. I think mostly, and then God saying, there's a section where God says, I'm gonna destroy them, and then a little later, like 4 verses later, it says, but I'll build them up and I'll show them love, and they shall be my people. I'm like, well, make up your mind.
It's kind of interesting. In my book, it's got a map of what it says, the divided kingdom.
Yeah.
And it has, the blue is the Israel, and the brown or the kind of oranges. The
Judah.
lower half is Judah.
Yeah.
And then it has kind of extended reaches afterwards. And in the blue part, it says the Valley of Jezreel, which is what we were just talking about there.
Yeah, and something happened there that's not. Someone was, yeah, something happened there.
Well, it's kind of neat though to actually be able to see the maps. So it sort of puts it in context of real people. You know, you're not just reading about, you know, people you don't have any idea. I mean, you can see where they lived. You see what, you know, what was going on at the time. It's really kind of cool.
Yep. That's why I sort of said that before, where the divided kingdom is divided by Samaria in the middle. It wasn't originally, but over time it was. By the time of Jesus, and it's sort of happening now, the two kingdoms are a bit separated geographically. Yeah, and Jezreel is somewhere in the middle. Yeah. Unlike chapter 2, chapter 3 is exceedingly short, and then the whole book sort of shifts a little bit here. The Lord said to me again, go love a woman who has a lover and is an adulteress, just as the Lord loves the people of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. Okay. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer of barley and a measure of wine. And I said to her, you must remain as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore. You shall not have intercourse with a man, nor I with you. For the Israelites shall remain many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or teraphim. Afterward, the Israelites shall return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king. They shall come in awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days.
That shows where the time frame is now with David their king.
Yeah. Well, yes and no. It's probably not literal David. It's probably the line of David, right? Yeah.
Okay.
I'm assuming, based on when they think this was written, when David probably was alive, it's been a while since David's been around. But if David is mentioned, I mean, when David is mentioned in the New Testament with regards to Jesus, because it's the line of David.
Yeah.
Anytime David's brought up, if David's name is in there, the reference is the appointed leaders of the people. Right? It doesn't necessarily mean that David himself shall be their king.
Okay.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Although I will double check.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely not the time of David. David's been not gone that long, maybe 300 or 400 years.
Still fresh enough to be able to refer back to, like you said, at least the lineage.
Right. Okay, so the sometimes when other books we've read shift, we think it might be a different author. There's a big shift here, but people don't think it's a different author. It's just a different writing in a different way about different sorts of things. So it becomes shorter prophetic sections, and a lot of the rest of the book, until we get at least to like chapter 11 or so, is kind of in this format, and then it kind of winds down with chapter 14. But the structure changes a little bit here, I guess. So hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or loyalty, and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder, stealing and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who live in it languish, together with the wild animals. And the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea, are perishing. Yet let no one contend and let none accuse, for with you is my contention, O priest. You shall stumble by day, the prophet also shall stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. I reject you from being a priest to me, and since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. The more they increase, the more they sin against me. They change their glory into shame. They feed on the sin of my people. They are greedy for their iniquity. And it shall be like people, like priests. I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They shall eat but not be satisfied. They shall play the whore but not multiply, because they have forsaken the Lord to devote themselves to whoredom. It's interesting that Hosea is condemning whoredom, but then God told him to marry and have children with a whore.
So this is confusing. He goes back and forth and back and forth. He really doesn't seem to have, or there doesn't seem to be a, I like things like 1, 2, 3, 4. This is like 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 3, 2, 4. He keeps going back and forth. And,
well, I mean, I think the theme is the people wander, at least here, about the people kind of wandering and not, it says not having knowledge, which is interesting, and being sinful. Interesting reading this on the first full day of Lent too, right? Talking about people straying from the Lord, right? It's an interesting connection. From what I can tell, Nancy, there's sort of I agree. But even chapter 2 that we read, they're condemned, but they're loved, but they're condemned, but they're loved.
uh-huh.
It feels a little like that, like it goes back and forth. Kind of less of a flow than we're used to. Did you feel like I felt it happens twice, where it says, you've messed up, so I'm going to forget all about you. I'm not going to love you, and I'm also going to forget your children. I both times that came up, I'm like, it's like a gut punch. It's not the children's fault. I read an article today that reminds me of about the people that are going to be hurt most by the Russian sanctions are the poorest people. And so you're like, I think sanctions are a good way to, for international other countries to try to help the situation, but it's the poor people that are going to suffer. Right. And that's why I thought about this, you've been bad, you've turned away from God, and I'm going to punish you, but because you have children, I'm also going to punish your children. It's like, why do you have to even say that? It twice, I think it says that in there. So that's hard to read, because it's an innocent bystander in the process of God's condemning of the people. I'm reading here that it could be a reference to destroying the lineage of the people. I will forget your children, sort of saying, you were mine, but I don't even want your lineage to be something that would taint the people or whatever, taint the future. It's still powerful, difficult language to hear. Wine and new wine will take away the understanding. My people consult a piece of wood, and their divining rod gives them oracles. For a spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have played the whore, forsaking their God. They sacrifice on the tops of the mountains and make offerings upon the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because the shade is good. Therefore your daughters play the whore, and your daughters-in-law commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go aside with whores and sacrifice to temple prostitutes. Thus a people without understanding comes to ruin. Though you play the whore, O Israel, do not let Judah become guilty. Do not enter into Gilgal or go up to Bethaven, and do not swear as the Lord lives. Like a stubborn heifer, Israel is stubborn. Can the Lord now feed them like a lamb in a broad pasture? Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone. When their drinking is ended, they indulge in sexual orgies. They love lewdness more than their glory. A wind has wrapped them in its wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their altars. So I just had a thought, and it's a horrible thought. And I hope no biblical scholars watch this, because not that anybody does, but he's so worried about sexual impurity, and yet he married a prostitute, essentially. It's like, sometimes people that rail against things the most are the ones that probably need the most, need the most forgiveness for those things sometimes. There was a fairly conservative pastor that was really well known, that was so anti-homosexuality in terms that he had a gay lover. They found out years later, and like, oh gosh, you were known as being this crusader against the gays, and then it turns out that's how this feels a little bit like to me, because he's all the sexual impurity. Oh yeah, you whores, you adulterers, da da da. But we learned at the very beginning he married someone who fit that description. It's just funny to me. I don't know. It really, and again, I think some of this is probably allegorical to. This starts off by saying the title of the section is the idolatry of Israel. So probably some of that is not so much actual individual infidelity and sexual impurity, but more worshiping the other gods. I think some of it.
I like the description where he likens Israel to a stubborn heifer, because that is very, very descriptive.
Yeah, that made me laugh. Yes, exactly.
Who does he mean by Ephraim is joined to idols? Leave him alone. Is that supposedly Israel also, or
a name for the northern kingdom?
northern? Okay.
Which is Israel, yeah. It ultimately, it's kind of like the earlier chapters. You think they're talking about individuals, but probably talking about the people, or maybe talking about individuals, but maybe about the people. Kind of go back and forth. Some of it is obviously talking about the nation, and some of it is hard to tell. I guess I was only going to do through chapter 4, but I think we can do chapter 5 probably. By the way, when you see, don't be afraid to ask. I don't always go back and refer, but if you see names like in verse 15, Gilgal or Bethaven, I don't always know what those things are. They're city places, but it's good to look those things up. So Bethaven is Hebrew for house of wrong, a pejorative name for the city of Bethel.
Okay.
And Gilgal and Bethel were cities that with once holy shrines that became places of apostasy with the rise of the monarchical state. So basically doing things the wrong way, teaching incorrect teaching and stuff in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And it must have been sort of known among the people those places are to fallen into it. Apostasy is like when you have a priest that's teaching the wrong stuff. That's essentially what apostasy is.
Yeah.
I got accused of it once by someone who was super conservative, and it made me feel like I must be doing the right thing. I'm committing apostasy. Oh, good. If you think I'm committing apostasy, I must be on the right track.
Yeah. Pastor, I heard recently that Gilgal was not
a town or a province or anything like that, but more like a specific place within a town, because it's mentioned several times about what recently, I can't remember exactly what, it seemed like the kings were crowned there or stuff like that. Didn't Saul go to Gilgal or
Maybe-
something like that?
what did I just read? What was this? Gilgal. Well, it says it was a city, but I don't know.
Uh-huh,
Um,
okay. all
with
right.
with a holy shrine. I don't know. It seems to me that Gilgal had some kind of specific purpose in much earlier in the scriptures, but I don't really remember.
Okay,
There is a reference here to, yeah, Joshua chapter 4 and Genesis chapter 35. That'll tell you it's been around for a while.
I looked up Gilgal,
Mhm.
and it's mentioned 39 times in the Bible, especially in the book of Joshua. And it's the place where the Israelites camped after crossing the Jordan River.
yeah, okay. Yeah, that's where I heard it.
Huh.
It means circle of stones.
Oh, okay.
Was that not where Joshua built the altar
Altar.
after?
Right. That's what I'm
Okay.
wondering, where he built
Okay.
the temporary altar. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a
Huh. That's an interesting.
geographical place, but not a town or a city.
Maybe
Yeah.
by the time of Hosea, which is much later, it's
Uh-huh.
it's a town. It's a city. It's hard to say. You know what? I am going to stop there, I think, because it's 10:52.
Mhm.
We started a little bit late, but I didn't read past chapter 4, so that's fine. A little bit shorter one today. I have I don't know how much Judy caught. She was in and out there, but we
I'm
did.
sorry.
No, you're
I've
fine.
had problems. It's not been my morning.
No problem. We did chapters 1 through 4 of Hosea.
Oh, 1 through 4. Okay, well, I will read it and I'll probably watch it. You've recorded it, right?
Yep. Well, we're still recording,
Oh, okay,
so you're going to be able to watch you talking about the recording on the recording.
okay.
What happened to Pat?
She was on. Sometimes her computer. Sometimes she struggles with the connection. She was on. I never heard her. Yeah. So, I'm gonna now. On that note, I will end.